Rodriguez's breaching charge exploded with controlled precision, blowing the reinforced door off its hinges and creating an opening into the main building. Morrison was through the doorway within seconds, his rifle trained on the dark corridor ahead. The interior of the building was a maze of narrow hallways and small rooms that could hide dozens of fighters. The diversionary attacks had drawn most of the defenders to the northern and eastern walls, but Morrison knew that Massoud would have personal bodyguards who wouldn't abandon their posts regardless of what was happening elsewhere in the compound. These would be the most experienced and dangerous fighters, men who had survived multiple coalition attacks and knew exactly how to use the building's layout to their advantage. Morrison's night vision revealed a staircase leading to the second floor, where intelligence reports placed Massoud's command center. The stairs were narrow and offered no cover, making them a natural choke point that defenders could use to devastating effect. Rodriguez positioned herself to provide covering fire while Morrison began his ascent. The first Taliban fighter appeared at the top of the stairs just as Morrison reached the halfway point. The man was carrying an AK-47 and clearly knew how to use it, but Morrison's training and equipment gave him a crucial advantage. His suppressed rifle eliminated the threat before the fighter could get off more than 2 wild shots that struck the concrete walls. Rodriguez followed Morrison up the stairs, her own weapon ready to engage any additional threats. The second floor was laid out exactly as the intelligence reports had described, with a central corridor leading to several rooms that served different functions. The command center was at the far end of the hallway, behind a reinforced door that would require additional breaching charges. As they moved down the corridor, Morrison could hear voices coming from one of the side rooms. The conversation was in Pashto, but the tone was urgent and seemed to involve coordinating defensive positions. Rodriguez indicated that she could identify at least 3 different speakers, suggesting that this might be a gathering of senior Taliban leaders rather than just ordinary fighters. Morrison made a split-second decision that would define the rest of the mission. Instead of proceeding directly to Massoud's suspected location, he signaled Rodriguez to prepare for a breach of the room where the voices were coming from. If multiple high-value targets were gathered in one location, the mission could achieve far more than originally planned. The breach was executed with textbook precision. Rodriguez's charge created an opening that allowed Morrison to enter the room with maximum tactical advantage. What he found inside exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Ahmad Shah Massoud was indeed present, but he was meeting with 2 other Taliban commanders who were on the coalition's most wanted list. The 3 men were studying maps and documents spread across a large table, apparently planning coordinated attacks against coalition forces throughout the region. Their surprise at the sudden appearance of American Special Operations Forces was complete, and Morrison was able to secure all 3 targets before they could reach the weapons that were positioned around the room. Rodriguez quickly secured the documents and electronic devices that covered the table. The intelligence value of these materials could be enormous, potentially revealing Taliban plans and capabilities that coalition forces had been trying to understand for months. The mission was achieving success beyond what anyone had dared to hope. However, the tactical situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. The sounds of the breaches and gunfire had alerted every fighter in the compound, and Morrison could hear boots on the stairs as reinforcements rushed toward their position. The diversionary attacks were drawing some attention, but not enough to prevent a significant response to the main building. Morrison's earpiece crackled with updates from Thompson, who reported that Taliban fighters were moving to surround the building. The sniper was doing his best to slow their approach, but his position in the creek bed was becoming untenable as the defenders began to focus their fire in his direction. Chen's voice came through the radio with orders to extract immediately. The intelligence gathered from the mission was too valuable to risk losing in a prolonged firefight, and the successful capture of 3 high-value targets had already made the operation a major success. The challenge now was getting everyone out alive. Morrison and Rodriguez began moving their prisoners toward the staircase, but gunfire from the ground floor indicated that Taliban fighters had already entered the building. They were trapped on the second floor with limited options for escape. The windows offered the only alternative exit, but they were 30 feet above the concrete courtyard. Rodriguez had anticipated this possibility and had brought specialized rappelling equipment as part of her standard loadout. While Morrison maintained security on the prisoners and watched the corridor for approaching threats, she rigged an anchor point that would allow them to descend quickly to the courtyard. The sound of boots on the stairs was getting closer, and Morrison could see muzzle flashes from the ground floor as Taliban fighters fired blindly up the stairway. Time was running out, and they needed to move immediately if they were going to escape with their prisoners and intelligence. Morrison made another crucial decision. Instead of attempting to fight their way down the stairs, they would use the window escape route that Rodriguez had prepared. The risk was significant, but it offered their best chance of reaching the extraction point with their valuable prisoners intact. Rodriguez went first, rappelling down the side of the building with one of the prisoners secured to her harness. Morrison followed with the remaining two captives, trusting his equipment and training to get them safely to the ground. The descent took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity as bullets struck the wall around them. Once on the ground, they moved quickly toward the breach in the western wall. Thompson had repositioned himself to provide covering fire for their escape route, and his accurate shooting was keeping the Taliban fighters at a safe distance. Martinez was coordinating with Chun to ensure that the extraction helicopters would be ready when the team reached the designated landing zone. The journey back through the creek bed was even more challenging with 3 prisoners in tow. Morrison and Rodriguez had to maintain security while ensuring that their captives couldn't escape or signal their location to pursuing fighters. The Taliban commanders were clearly experienced in combat situations and were looking for any opportunity to turn the tables on their captors. Thompson provided rear-guard security as they moved through the creek bed, his rifle eliminating any pursuers who came too close. The sound of gunfire from the compound was diminishing as Chin's team executed their own extraction plan, having successfully completed their role in the diversionary attacks. The extraction helicopters were waiting at a landing zone 2 kilometers from the compound, their crews ready to provide immediate medical attention and secure transport for the prisoners. Morrison felt a surge of relief as he saw the aircraft in the distance, their navigation lights barely visible against the pre-dawn sky. As they approached the landing zone, Morrison reflected on the mission that had seemed impossible just hours before. The breakthrough had come not from superior firepower or advanced technology, but from careful observation and the willingness to take calculated risks when conventional approaches had failed. Rodriguez had proven herself to be an outstanding operator, adapting quickly to changing circumstances and executing complex technical tasks under extreme pressure. Thompson's marksmanship had been crucial in keeping the team alive during the most dangerous phases of the mission. Martinez had maintained vital communications links that allowed the team to coordinate their efforts effectively. The helicopters lifted off just as the sun was beginning to rise over the Afghan landscape. Morrison looked down at the compound they had just left and saw Taliban fighters searching the area around the breach site. The enemy was undoubtedly trying to understand how a small team of coalition forces had succeeded where larger operations had failed. Back at the forward operating base, the debriefing sessions would last for days as intelligence analysts studied the documents and electronic devices that Rodriguez had captured. The 3 Taliban commanders would provide valuable information about enemy operations and planning, potentially saving countless coalition lives in future operations. Morrison knew that the success of this mission would influence how special operations forces approached similar challenges in the future. The willingness to abandon conventional tactics and develop innovative solutions had made the difference between failure and spectacular success. As the helicopter carried them towards safety, Morrison thought about the lessons learned during this operation. Military training and equipment were essential, but success often depended on the ability to think creatively and adapt when standard procedures weren't enough. The mission had demonstrated that even the most challenging tactical situations could be overcome through careful observation, innovative planning, and precise execution. Morrison had proven that a single operator with the right combination of experience and insight could indeed change the outcome of an operation that seemed doomed to failure. The Taliban stronghold that had withstood multiple attacks was now empty, its commanders in custody, and its intelligence value completely compromised. The local population would be safer, coalition forces would have better intelligence about enemy activities, and the mission would serve as a model for future special operations. Morrison closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The mission had succeeded beyond all expectations, and every member of the team had performed with the professionalism and courage that defined America's Special Operations Forces. The impossible had become possible through determination, skill, and the willingness to find solutions when others saw only obstacles. The war would continue, and there would be other missions, other challenges, and other opportunities to serve. But this night had proven once again that the right people with the right training could accomplish things that seemed impossible to everyone else. Morrison and his team had changed the game, and their success would inspire others to push beyond conventional limitations when faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges. Morrison's voice came through the radio with a calmness that surprised even him. After studying the compound for hours, he had noticed something that changed everything. While the other team members focused on the obvious defensive positions, Morrison had been watching the patterns of movement within the compound. His years of experience had taught him to look beyond the immediate tactical situation and consider the human element. The Taliban fighters were rotating their guards every 2 hours, but there was a 15-minute gap in coverage on the western side of the compound. During the guard change, the relief sentries would gather in the main building for a brief meeting before taking their positions. This created a narrow window of opportunity that the previous teams had missed because they had focused on the more obvious approaches from the north and east. Lieutenant Commander Chen listened to Morrison's observations with growing interest. The western approach had been dismissed during planning because it appeared to offer no cover and would require crossing an open area under direct observation from the guard towers. However, Morrison had identified a dry creek bed that ran within 50 meters of the western wall. The depression was only 3 feet deep, but it would provide concealment for a small team moving in single file. What made Morrison's plan even more intriguing was his analysis of the sensor network. The motion detectors were positioned to monitor the obvious approach routes, but they had gaps in coverage that could be exploited by someone willing to take a more difficult path. The western approach would require crawling through the creek bed for nearly 200 meters, but it would avoid most of the electronic surveillance. Chun faced a difficult decision. Morrison's plan would require splitting the team, with most operators maintaining their positions as a diversion while a small assault group attempted the western approach. If the smaller team was discovered, they would be isolated and outnumbered with no easy escape route. The risk was enormous, but so was the potential for success. Morrison volunteered to lead the assault team personally. His reputation and experience made him the logical choice, but Chun was reluctant to approve such a dangerous mission. Navy SEALs were trained to accept calculated risks, but this plan pushed the boundaries of acceptable risk even by special operations standards. The discussion continued for 20 minutes as Chun consulted with the other team leaders and the command center. The mission had already been delayed several times, and intelligence indicated that Massoud might relocate within hours. The window for action was closing rapidly, and indecision could be as dangerous as the wrong decision. Finally, Chen approved Morrison's plan with significant modifications. Instead of a 2-man assault team, she authorized 4 operators for the western approach. Rodriguez would provide demolitions expertise, Thompson would serve as the designated marksman, and Martinez would handle medical support. The remaining team members would create diversions at the north and east walls to draw attention away from the main assault. Morrison felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he prepared for the modified mission. The additional team members would provide valuable support, but they also increased the chances of detection during the approach phase. Moving 4 people through the creek bed without being seen would require perfect coordination and a considerable amount of luck. The team began moving into position at 3 in the morning, taking advantage of the darkest hours before dawn. Morrison led the way, using hand signals to communicate with his teammates as they made their way toward the creek bed. Every step had to be carefully planned to avoid loose rocks or vegetation that might create noise. The creek bed was even more challenging than it appeared from a distance. The bottom was covered with smooth stones that shifted under their weight, creating a constant risk of noise that could alert the sentries. Thorny bushes grew along the banks, catching on their equipment and clothing as they moved forward. The slow progress was frustrating, but Morrison knew that patience was often the difference between success and failure in special operations. As they moved closer to the compound, Morrison could hear voices from inside the walls. The Taliban fighters were speaking in hushed tones, but their words carried clearly in the still night air. Rodriguez, who spoke some Dari, was able to provide translations that gave valuable intelligence about the defenders' state of mind and their knowledge of coalition forces in the area. The guard change happened exactly as Morrison had predicted. Through his night vision scope, he watched as the sentries gathered in the main building, leaving their positions temporarily unmanned. The window of opportunity was small, but it was enough for what they needed to accomplish. Morrison signaled for Rodriguez to prepare the breaching charges. The demolitions expert had modified her standard equipment for this mission, creating smaller charges that would create a hole in the wall without generating the massive explosion that would alert every defender in the compound. The shaped charges were designed to create a precise opening that would allow the team to enter quickly and quietly. Thompson positioned himself to provide overwatch from the creek bed. His sniper rifle was equipped with a suppressor that would muffle the sound of any shots he might need to take. His role was to eliminate any sentries who discovered the breach before the assault team could enter the compound. Martinez remained in the creek bed as the team's lifeline to the outside world. Her radio equipment would maintain communication with Chun and the other team members, and her medical training might be crucial if any of the assault team members were wounded during the operation. Morrison checked his watch and confirmed that they were still within the 15-minute window. The shaped charges were in position, and his team was ready to move. He made one final check of his equipment and prepared to give the signal that would commit them to the most dangerous phase of the mission. The charges detonated with a muffled thump that was barely audible beyond the immediate area. The explosion created a hole in the concrete wall that was just large enough for a person to crawl through quickly. Morrison went first, emerging into a small courtyard that was temporarily empty of guards. The layout of the compound was exactly as the intelligence reports had described, but seeing it in person gave Morrison a better understanding of the tactical challenges they faced. The main building loomed ahead of them, its windows dark and seemingly empty. However, Morrison knew that appearances could be deceiving, and that trained fighters could be waiting in positions that offered both concealment and excellent fields of fire. Rodriguez followed Morrison through the breach, her equipment making soft metallic sounds as she moved. Thompson remained in the creek bed, maintaining overwatch and ready to provide covering fire if needed. Martinez monitored the radio frequencies, listening for any indication that the breach had been detected by other elements of the Taliban force. Morrison and Rodriguez moved across the courtyard using techniques they had practiced hundreds of times in training. They moved from cover to cover, pausing frequently to observe and listen before making their next move. The main building had multiple entrances, and intelligence suggested that Massoud was most likely located on the second floor in what had been identified as a command and control center. As they approached the main building, Morrison heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the distinctive click of a safety being released on an automatic weapon, followed by the rustle of clothing as someone shifted position. They had been detected, and within seconds, the entire compound would be alive with Taliban fighters attempting to kill or capture them. Morrison's training took over immediately. Without conscious thought, he rolled behind a concrete barrier while simultaneously signaling Rodriguez to take cover behind a nearby vehicle. The first shots came from a window on the second floor, muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the darkness as bullets struck the ground where Morrison had been standing moments before. The element of surprise was gone, but the mission was far from over. Morrison knew that Chun and the other team members would begin their diversionary attacks within minutes, drawing some of the defensive fire away from his position. The question was whether he and Rodriguez could survive long enough to take advantage of that diversion. Rodriguez was already moving toward the building's main entrance, using her knowledge of urban warfare to find the best approach route. Morrison provided covering fire, his suppressed rifle sending carefully aimed shots toward the windows where muzzle flashes had revealed enemy positions. The sound of gunfire had awakened the entire compound. Morrison could hear shouting in multiple languages as fighters rushed to their defensive positions. The guard towers were lighting up the compound with powerful searchlights, creating stark shadows that could provide either concealment or dangerous exposure, depending on how they were used. Thompson's voice came through Morrison's earpiece, reporting that he had eliminated 2 sentries who were attempting to flank their position from the eastern wall. Martinez was coordinating with Chun to ensure that the diversionary attacks would begin at precisely the right moment to provide maximum support for the assault team. Morrison realized that everything they had trained for was being tested in these crucial minutes. The success or failure of the mission would depend on their ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances while maintaining focus on their primary objective. Massoud was somewhere in that building, and capturing him remained their highest priority despite the tactical situation that was developing around them. The sound of explosions from the northern wall indicated that Chun had begun the diversionary attacks. Rodriguez used that distraction to reach the main entrance of the building, where she began preparing breaching charges that would allow them to enter and search for their target. Morrison knew that the next few minutes would determine whether their bold plan would succeed or whether they would be forced to fight their way out of an increasingly desperate situation. The mission that had seemed impossible just hours before was now within reach. But the most dangerous part was still ahead of them. The desert wind carried sand like tiny bullets across the rocky terrain of Afghanistan's Helmand province. Master Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison crouched behind a boulder, his eyes scanning the compound ahead through night vision goggles. The green-tinted world revealed a fortress-like structure that had become the headquarters for one of the most dangerous Taliban commanders in the region. Morrison had been a Navy SEAL for 12 years, but this mission felt different. The intelligence reports painted a grim picture. Ahmad Shah Massoud, a high-value target responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces, was hiding inside that compound with at least 30 heavily armed fighters. What made this mission particularly challenging was the compound's location, perched on a hillside with clear sight lines in every direction, making any approach extremely dangerous. The SEAL team had been planning this operation for 3 weeks. SEAL Team 6 had assigned 16 operators to the mission, led by Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun, a brilliant tactical mind who had successfully completed dozens of high-risk operations. The team included specialists in demolitions, communications, medical support, and reconnaissance. Each member had been handpicked for their expertise and experience in similar operations. Morrison remembered the briefing room back at the forward operating base. Maps covered every surface, satellite images showed every angle of the target building, and 3D models helped the team understand the terrain they would face. Chen had walked them through the plan multiple times. They would approach under cover of darkness, neutralize the sentries, breach the compound walls, and capture or eliminate Massoud before dawn. The plan seemed solid on paper, but as Morrison lay in the sand watching the compound, he could see why previous attempts had failed. 3 different special operations teams had tried to take this position over the past 6 months. Each time, they had been forced to retreat under heavy fire. The Taliban fighters weren't just random insurgents. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and knew exactly how to use their defensive position. The compound sat at the top of a gradual slope, surrounded by a 12-foot concrete wall topped with razor wire. Guard towers at each corner provided overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible approach route. During daylight reconnaissance, Morrison had counted at least 8 heavy machine gun positions and what appeared to be mortar tubes hidden behind the walls. The main building was a 3-story structure made of reinforced concrete, with small windows that could serve as firing ports. What worried Morrison most was the intelligence about Massoud himself. The Taliban commander wasn't just hiding. He was actively coordinating attacks from his position. Every day they delayed meant more coalition casualties elsewhere in the province. The pressure from command was intense. They needed results, and they needed them soon. As Morrison adjusted his position, he felt the familiar weight of his gear. His M4 carbine was equipped with the latest optics and suppressor. His plate carrier held extra ammunition, grenades, and the specialized equipment needed for the mission. On his back, A radio system kept him connected to his teammates and the command center miles away. Everything had been checked and double-checked, yet something felt wrong. The team had moved into position 3 hours before midnight, taking advantage of a moonless night that provided excellent cover. They had traveled the last 2 miles on foot, moving in perfect silence through terrain that seemed designed to betray any movement. Loose rocks, thorny vegetation, and steep inclines had tested their conditioning and patience. Morrison's earpiece crackled softly as Chin's voice came through the radio. Her tone was calm and professional, but he could detect the underlying tension. The preliminary reconnaissance had revealed a problem that none of their intelligence had predicted. The Taliban fighters had installed motion sensors and camera systems around the perimeter. What should have been a stealth operation was about to become a deadly game of cat and mouse with an enemy that would see them coming. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, the team's demolitions expert, had already identified the sensor network during her approach to the eastern wall. The devices were military-grade equipment, not the improvised systems they usually encountered. Someone with serious training and resources had helped fortify this position. The implications were troubling. This wasn't just a Taliban stronghold, but possibly a training facility or meeting place for multiple terrorist organizations. The original plan called for simultaneous breaches at 3 points around the compound. Now, with the sensor network in place, any movement would trigger alarms and floodlights that would expose the entire team to concentrated fire from the guard towers. Chin was facing a tactical nightmare with no easy solutions. Morrison had seen similar situations end badly. Teams would push forward with the original plan, hoping to overcome the unexpected obstacles through speed and violence of action. Sometimes it worked, but more often it resulted in casualties that could have been avoided with better intelligence or different tactics. He thought about the families back home, the wives and children who trusted that their loved ones would return safely from these dangerous missions. Through his night vision, Morrison could see his teammates taking cover positions around the compound. Each green figure represented years of training, sacrifice, and dedication to their country. Petty Officer Second Class Mike Thompson was positioned near the northern approach, his sniper rifle ready to provide cover fire. Chief Petty Officer David Park had responsibility for the communications equipment that would coordinate the assault. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Lisa Martinez carried the medical supplies that might mean the difference between life and death if things went wrong. The weight of responsibility pressed down on Morrison's shoulders. He wasn't the mission commander, but his experience and reputation meant that younger operators looked to him for guidance in difficult situations. They trusted his judgment, his ability to see solutions that others might miss. As he studied the compound through his scope, Morrison's mind raced through possibilities and alternatives. The Taliban fighters inside weren't passive defenders waiting for an attack. Morrison could see movement in the guard towers, evidence that they were maintaining active patrols and communication. These weren't the undisciplined militants that some operations encountered. They moved with purpose and coordination that spoke of professional military training. Intelligence reports suggested that Massoud might be planning to relocate within the next 48 hours. If the SEAL team failed tonight, there might not be another opportunity for weeks or months. The pressure to succeed was enormous, but Morrison knew that pressure could lead to poor decisions and unnecessary risks. As he lay in the darkness, Morrison thought about his own journey to this moment. Growing up in a small town in Montana, he had never imagined that he would one day be part of America's most elite special operations forces. His father had been a Marine, killed in action when Morrison was just 8 years old. That loss had shaped his understanding of sacrifice and duty, eventually leading him to enlist in the Navy and pursue the grueling training that would make him a SEAL. The path to becoming a Navy SEAL had tested every aspect of his physical and mental capabilities. Basic underwater demolition/SEAL training had pushed him beyond what he thought possible. The cold waters of California, the endless physical challenges, the sleep deprivation, and the constant pressure had eliminated more than 80% of the candidates who started the program with him. Those who survived learned to function effectively under the most difficult conditions imaginable. Morrison's specialty was urban warfare and close-quarters combat, but his real strength was his ability to adapt when plans went wrong. Military operations rarely unfolded exactly as planned, and the most successful operators were those who could think clearly and act decisively when facing unexpected challenges. Tonight was testing that ability in ways that few previous missions had. The radio crackled again as Chin's voice provided an update on the situation. The team had been in position for 4 hours, gathering intelligence and waiting for the optimal moment to begin the assault. What they had learned during that time was not encouraging. The compound's defenses were even more sophisticated than they had realized. Motion sensors, cameras, and what appeared to be automated weapons systems created a defensive network that would be extremely difficult to penetrate without significant casualties. Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, allowing his other senses to gather information about his surroundings. The desert night was filled with subtle sounds that could provide valuable intelligence. He could hear the distant hum of generators inside the compound, suggesting that the defenders had reliable power for their electronic systems. The occasional radio chatter in local dialects confirmed that they were maintaining active communication with other positions in the area. When Morrison opened his eyes, his night vision had adjusted even better to the darkness. He could see details that had been invisible before, including what appeared to be additional defensive positions that hadn't been identified during the planning phase. The Taliban fighters had clearly learned from previous attacks and had adapted their defenses accordingly. The mission was reaching a critical decision point. Chin would need to either modify the plan significantly or abort the operation altogether. Neither option was appealing, but the alternative might be sending good people into a situation where success was unlikely and casualties were almost certain. Morrison keyed his radio and spoke quietly into his microphone. His words would either save lives or commit the team to a course of action that would test every aspect of their training and courage. The next few minutes would determine whether this mission became another failure or the breakthrough that everyone was hoping for. The SEALs couldn't advance. One operator changed that.